And I would always have to do convenient sampling where it was near a road, all that stuff. So if I had more access, if I could create a better plot design, I would go into areas where that weren't so accessible, and that's where I would have those elevation gradients start. That's where I would have the line transects. Now my transects were not exactly lined; they were more like bubble clusters. So I would try maybe suggesting line transects, and then again like clustered transects.
So more money, more time.
Yes, and also access would be the
More
thing.
like a PhD dissertation.
For sure. Yeah.
I do know that I'm kind of asking that, but, and do you think that something specific to Santa Clara County would look different from in other areas, like some of your literature?
I think yes, yeah, definitely literature, even if the study was happening in the Alps or in Spanish montane environments, it was always specific to the geographic and the vegetation communities found there, because sometimes the oaks were in open, sparse assembly, or sometimes you found them in close clustered communities. So that always has to be factored into your plot design.
So it's an important thing.
Very,
ecosystem specificity.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why we need it, because we can't. I found from the study you can't start predicting and following forecasts if you don't have the regional, if you don't have the local findings. It's just not useful.
Thank you. Excellent job. Really, really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I also just wanted to congratulate you on a really excellent talk. As Lynn was saying, I think you did a really great job on explaining the theory and being really thorough about looking into the theory as ways to develop hypotheses. So that was really great. And I think kind of going along the same lines, this probably isn't stuff that you looked at during this study, but curious maybe if you did further work. Is there any relationship between the plant size, like DBH and elevation, like areas that are more suitable for oaks in terms of how they grow? And also kind of getting at the ecosystem question, like curious if there's like we talked about biomass as being attractive to Herbivory. Is that related to sort of the density of the canopy cover, sort of the close proximity of trees that might foster additional herbivory?
Yeah, I actually saw studies or encountered studies where the focus was on the population dynamics of the host plant and how the proximity, and even having if it was on an elevational context, making sure that there was like north-facing sites. All these things, because I think you've even commented on my paper, the exposure, all the phenological cues, all those conditions needed to be accounted for when testing plant size and see hypotheses. So,
you picked 4 phenolic compounds to look at. There's probably lots of other ones, right?
Yeah.
So why did you select these?
Because the literature said that oaks have them, and it was pretty hard to find the chemicals that weren't so expensive to test that also were found in coastal live oaks. Yeah, it's quite hard. There's a lot on very expensive ones, but yeah, these are the ones. But definitely, if with more resources, I think not only phenolic compounds, but other groups of defense compounds would be studied, because there's just so many that in itself is not fully understood. What exactly deters insects? Which chemical exactly does that?
So the resource availability hypothesis was, basically your results contradicted what was predicted.
Yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, and you might not know something with that, but was there some study where that hypothesis did work quite well, and what system was that?
Those were the systems found in Spain, and that was with the common garden sites. There were lots of different ways that the herbivory was both observed in the field and then even simulated in lab, in situ in lab, and then also in garden experiments. So perhaps that may, I'm not quite sure, but
So gardens, not necessarily in a natural ecosystem.
yeah. So it was so it would be at the elevation, and then they would even plant. They were allowed to plant corresponding. I don't think I'd be able to, but they were allowed to plant a corresponding garden experiment, and then they even had they took some of the larvae and simulated it in the lab.
And those roads.
Those were oaks, yes, Spanish oaks.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, other questions for Alicia?
Good. A lot of work, good job for getting out there and getting all those trees. It's great, and it's great that you're able to do some chemistry with it. It's a lot of neat colors. I'm intrigued by your DBH, and does DBH correspond with anything else you can think of?
From
For
literature.
plant's eye view.
For DBH, in terms of this context, I just knew that it had to do with higher dispersion rates. Like there were I saw studies.
I was thinking plant age, maybe?
Oh yes, of course, maturity. But there are a lot of factors that you can have the same age, but still have the size doesn't correlate. So it might just be that single characteristic, independent of age.
Things that might be additional potential factors that would influence
Mhm.
the
higher
herbivory.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
if a tree had been there for a long time, you could see behavioral changes in the insect communities potentially. And I just something to think about as you move forward with the
Something
next
else
thing.
to
And the other thing is that, do you know if Adelphi is a specialist or a generalist?
generalist. Yeah.
So does it have
Within the oak, so specialist, it does focus on oaks, but not just the coastline oak, so oaks in general.
So it's an oak specialist.
Oak specialist, yes, sorry.
So if you sort of think about coevolution, I'm wondering whether you might have a different prediction for a specialist on oak chemicals versus a more generalist. Would it be more of a feeding and deterrent, or maybe more of a feeding promoter?
Yeah, I mean, there are plant herbivore studies that compare the specialists and as opposed to generalists. And again, that would be great to do, but I think I actually chose the specialist because it spoke to my target specimens. But yeah, but if I really wanted multiple transects, multiple species, I would probably try to.
One thing was sort of more in the discussion end of things. I could imagine that bully for you for trying to do chemistry. Chemistry is super hard.
No, I
There may be
I
another
sent that out.
chemical that you missed. So if the theory is that the defense chemicals would be greater in the lower elevations, is that what the theory is? What's the theory? I didn't quite catch that.
Sure. It's so there'd be more herbivory, the lower elevations.
More herbivory, that's fewer defenses?
No, there would be more chemical defenses, less physical, morphological traits.
So the theory is that just in terms of plant chemical
Let's go to
defenses.
the-
Okay.
Let's go to the thing so that I don't get confused.
So one insect's defense is another's feeding, and so that's what I'm trying to point out here.
What? Sorry, say that again. What insect?
So just, I didn't mean to distract you. So you're expecting higher chemical defenses at lower elevations, right?
Right, exactly.
And lower herbivory at higher. Oh, that's very confusing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Higher defenses at higher herbivory?
Higher
That's the
defenses.
theory?
Higher defenses, but chemical defenses. It makes a distinction between chemical defenses and the physiological, morphological resource traits.
Okay, I'm not familiar with this hypothesis, but that seems counterintuitive,
Mhm.
that the plants would be more defended and have more herbivory.
Right.
That's really the theory?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, so I might challenge that theory. and I might-
Sure.
I'm really impressed with that theory you have.
I might actually say that on the face of it, it's illogical.
Mhm.
So I don't know what they found or why, but
Sure.
you found basically that there was lower herbivory, which if in fact there were chemical defenses you didn't measure that were higher, it would have corresponded for a generalist. Now, that doesn't relate with that theory very well at all about a specialist that might tolerate higher chemical defenses.
Right.
If there were higher chemical defenses. But anyways, I think it's important to differentiate between what you think that the insect is doing and what you predict for your species, that's all.
Anything else?
Other questions? Yes.
Anybody?
So you also say it's lower physical defense for the, in the plants at lower elevations. So is that physical defense also supposed to be against like herbivory, or is it against? Oh,
Okay, so yeah, it'd be like thicker leaf cuticle, just less palatable. I don't know why this is a leaf, but what else? The plant palatability would be altered, which still has to do with plant chemicals, obviously, but it's just grouped as morphological traits. Yeah,
So could like is the theory kind of that maybe like
it's just investment of which strategies
so
the
I
plant
wonder
could
if,
use.
if the higher insect herbivory is encountering lower physical defense, and for some reason like the chemical defenses aren't as detrimental to them for some reason. I'm just like curious about
Sure.
the reason behind like the method, like how they got to that that hypothesis.
And I think it's just a series of plant herbivore studies where there was observed emission of volatile compounds, all these different things at lower elevations, and yet there was no evidence of a morphological change as opposed to what might happen in the higher elevations. So maybe they just ran with that. It was something to investigate.
Were any of your sites influenced by fog?
Historically, I didn't see any. Well, in Mount, on the top of Mount Hamilton, so Lick Observatory. So that might be a huge factor that was missing from. Also didn't have enough precipitation data. I originally wanted to use precipitation data, but there wasn't enough historic records from the weather station to actually do that. But yeah, fog. Yeah.
I have a question about like your test sites. I'm
Sure.
not super familiar with the range of Mount Hamilton.
Sure.
But in those four areas along the gradient, are they like older growth oak like stands, or are they newer like reforested areas, or like what's the
So
history
it
of
was
them?
quite mixed, but I did choose sites that were old growth.
I guess just like one thing that I was thinking of the phenolics is like when you're doing restoration, sometimes when you put in saplings, they're not like the babies of that stand, you know, so it could be that you have a young sapling at high elevation that actually is from a lower elevation. So I was just curious about like the 1.5 meter height saplings.
Right, that as a criteria.
Yeah, that could change, yeah.
Absolutely, it could change the results and the relationship altogether, like what I was trying to find, yeah.
I had a methodology question. You said you measured herbivory rates in this. How do you actually like quantify how much a tree has been eaten?
Yeah, sure. So
Are you
the
looking at
method.
individual leaves, like
Yeah,
walking along
sure.
a branch?
So it was only, the method was 2 branches, and then I counted the leaf area that was missing, and I would use, it's not like I did that, I had on my phone or even just a transparency with a grid, basically. And then of course I would count as well, but that grid also was what I used for all my metrics.
How did you select the branches?
I always chose the lower, it was a guideline in one of the studies of those two older branches that were chosen.
Other questions? Okay, so at this point, we will convene out here and have some more.
Do I go with you guys or you just, okay. Special Harry Potter. Kudos on you for not like falling asleep, because I almost fell asleep during my own song.
Is there any research on like a latitude ingredients
Yes.
that could change
That was
things?
the first type. Before this was used as like on one mountain. These were all for like temperate tropicals. Yeah, so that's why I was like, that was like the main use of it. And I was like, local. So they started doing
That looked like it was a lot further south.